So in 1996, my family and my grandparents decided to take a trip to Eastern Europe to visit the hometowns of my grandparents. They were Holocaust survivors. My grandfather was in a work camp, and my grandmother was in Auschwitz. And they hadn't been back since they immigrated to the U.S. In 1946. So it was 50 years, and we decided to go back before it was too late. My grandfather at the time was 85 years old, and my grandmother miraculously was still 39. I don't understand how that worked, but it was amazing. So it was really it was an incredible trip for us. But what was really shocking to me, I was 10 years old at the time, and I really didn't quite understand that my grandparents were really from other places. They had accents, and they clearly were kind of foreigners, but they were living out the stereotypical suburban dream of America in the San Fernando Valley. And they had an orange tree in their backyard and a Cadillac in their garage, and there was Little League a few blocks away. I mean, it was the American dream. So this idea that they wanted to go back somewhere foreign didn't really resonate with me at all. I had a really hard time understanding that. But we decided to go back, and it was really interesting because the area my grandparents were from was part of this Carpathian Mountain area that kept on having an identity crisis in the 20th century. And when my grandfather was born in 1910, it was Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it was Hungary, and then it was Czechoslovakia, and then it was Hungary again, and then after World War II, it was the USSR, and then when we went there, it was Ukraine. So really, we weren't going to anywhere any of us had actually been before. It was a little bit interesting. So when we got to Eastern Europe, and one of the first places we went was Kostrya, my grandfather's one-road farming village in the middle of the Carpathian Mountains that was absolutely, time had not touched this place whatsoever. In fact, I think the outhouse was the exact same one that he had grown up in. Which I felt like was part of my coming of age into my family a little bit. And his nephew, my grandfather's nephew, my father's cousin, was still living in the house that my grandfather had grown up in. And it was amazing. We sat in the kitchen that my grandfather had all his meals in. He took us around the fields around his house and showed us where he played. He showed us the shack that he had burnt down and then had to rebuild. With his brothers when he was a child. He taught me how to skip rocks in the same river that he had learned to skip rocks. And my grandfather, who was 85 at the time, came alive. He had been transformed into this man that I had never known before. A 10-year-old and an 85-year-old have very little in common, but all of a sudden he was this lively, brilliant man who could play with me and show me so much of his life. And I will always cherish that day. It was the most, it stuck with me until now, and it still is this bright, shining light. It was the youngest I had ever seen of my grandfather. And it truly was a homecoming for him. And a couple days later, we went to Ungvar, or Usharud, depending on what language you speak, which is the Paris of the Carpathian Mountains, city that my grandmother had always, that she always talked so fondly about. My grandmother really had always had this vision of our hometown as being this hidden gem in the middle of nowhere. And it was really, we thought we were going to go see this undiscovered area of Ukraine that other people didn't know about. And we were all so excited because she had talked about it with such fondness and such love. But it wasn't quite the city that she had remembered. The Soviet-era utilitarian architecture, to say the least, diminished the charm a little bit of her home city. And the affluent metropolis that she had remembered was very much now stricken with poverty and government neglect, and the city was truly a shell of what it had once been. And this really kind of destroyed my grandmother a lot. And then to top it off, when we went to the street that my grandmother was from, at first she couldn't even recognize her own home. We couldn't find it. And the reason for that is when we did discover where her home was, it was completely covered, surrounded by a giant wall, and on top of the wall was barbed wire. And the gate into the property was so reinforced we couldn't even see a little bit in. And my grandmother was destroyed. I mean, in that moment, she broke down. This pillar of strength, this woman who had survived scarlet fever and Auschwitz and losing her first child and then immigrating to America and had gone through so much and was always so strong and sold real estate in the valley. She was torn apart and broken to pieces. And as a 10-year-old, I couldn't understand why we had gone there. I was so angry with my family. All I saw was how destroyed my grandmother was, and it killed me inside. Because how dare my father, my mother, my grandparents, they take me on this trip that was only causing her heartache. To me, I didn't understand why we were there in the first place. And as a 10-year-old, I didn't quite understand how important it was for my grandmother to actually stand in the place that she had known, but realizing that she was also simultaneously in a foreign country where they spoke a language she did not speak and had no recollection, had nothing to really hold her to her past. It was important for her to see that. I understand that now, but back then, it just killed me as her granddaughter. And we couldn't leave fast enough, these Paris of the Carpathian Mountains. And a few days later, we were back in Los Angeles, and I was helping my grandmother into the house with the orange trees and the Cadillac in the garage. And as she opened the door, she breathed this huge sigh of relief and said, "Isn't it great to finally be home?"